Welcome to the 700 Club. It's not a done deal, and it's not even close. Congress and the White House still have no consensus on the debt ceiling. With the June 1st deadline looming, some are saying it's already too late.
If the government defaults on its debt payments, economic recession is predicted to follow, along with millions of jobs lost and billions of dollars evaporating from the stock market. Dale Hurd reports.
After a weekend of on-again, off-again negotiations over raising the government debt ceiling, there's still nothing close to agreement between congressional Republicans and the White House. Joe Biden landed back in Washington overnight after the G7 summit, cutting off the second half of his trip to the Asia-Pacific region. He spoke to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy by phone yesterday, and both sounded somewhat positive.
I believe it was a productive phone call.
But there's still no deal, and Biden and McCarthy will meet this afternoon with congressional leaders. Republicans want the government to spend less next year than this year. The White House proposed raising taxes on business.
I've been very clear to them from the very beginning. We have to spend less money than we spent last year.
Biden is calling Republican demands extreme.
I think there are some MAGA Republicans in the House who know the damage that it would do to the economy. And because I am president and president's responsible for everything, Biden would take the blame.
Biden says he believes he has the legal right to invoke the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to raise the debt ceiling. But there's not enough time to get through the legal challenges. Senator Ted Cruz called Biden's view legally frivolous.
By the way, someone else who agreed with that was Barack Obama. The left tried to convince Obama to do this, and Obama said, no, you can't do this under the Constitution.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said again over the weekend she believes June 1st is the hard deadline for a default if there's no deal. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that a default would tip the economy into a recession, costing more than 7 million jobs and causing the stock market to lose 20% of its value. Former Defense Secretary and CIA Director Bob Gates told CBS's Face the Nation the crisis is hurting America's global reputation.
Having these episodes of great crisis and then some solution at the last second really feeds a notion that the U.S. political system isn't working at all.
And making matters worse, one Republican lawmaker suggested the crisis was already past the point of no return, saying there's no way Congress could reach an agreement by the June 1st deadline. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Well, it's high time people recognize it's the crisis itself that's the problem. It's not whether or not we're going to come to some, 11th hour agreement or even 12th hour agreement. It's because we keep going from crisis to crisis politically that we can't ever form consensus and we can't govern ourselves. How can we possibly govern the free world if we can't even govern ourselves? And one of the biggest things that's missing from all of the politics here is we're absolutely spending more money than the federal government earns. Our tax receipts don't ever match our expenses. And if you don't recognize that's a problem, well, there's another problem with that, because all you're doing is printing money in order to satisfy some kind of political agenda or some kind of special constituency. All of those things in the long run spell doom for our economy, doom for our currency, and doom for our government. This is where democracies go to die, when the electorate figures out you can vote yourself to Treasury. That's what's happening right now, and it's happening on both sides. You can't say it's a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. It's happening on both sides, and all administrations since Bush. His Vice President Cheney said famously, deficits don't matter. Well, here we are 20 years later, and yep, they do matter. And when we have these continual deficit budgets, well, we can't possibly get out of this hole. In other news, the Biden administration has announced a major shift in America's support for Ukraine. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That's right. That shift is Ukrainian pilots on F-16 fighter planes. President Biden had been firmly against giving F-16s to the Ukrainians over concerns it would lead to an escalation with Russia. Now he's giving the green light.
I have a flat assurance from Zelensky that they will not use it to go on and move into Russian geographic territory.
The training is expected to begin in a few weeks and will take months to complete. In the meantime, the coalition will determine how many jets to send and when. Russia warned that Western countries could face huge risks for the move. The United States also announced an additional $375 million in military aid to Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky at the summit expressing his gratitude for the support. Well, turning now to the Republican race for president, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott is set to formally announce his campaign today at Charleston Southern University, a private Baptist college and Scott's alma mater in his hometown. Scott, the only black Republican in the Senate, describes himself as a born-again believer. CBN News White House correspondent Abigail Robertson will interview Senator Scott after his announcement today. You can see their conversation on tomorrow's 700 Club, as well as the CBN News Channel and on YouTube. Well, presidential politics seems to highlight the divisions in America like nothing else. Some of those issues are also making inroads into our churches. CBN's Gary Lane recently talked to two bridge builders who shared some biblical thoughts on loving each other in the culture despite the agreements.
Political disagreements over Donald Trump and Joe Biden and a potentially hostile election season are fracturing America. The country is polarized and deeply divided over politics and culture, and the divisions have even crept into the church. Pastor Dan Darling addresses the problem in his most recent book, Agents of Grace: How to Bridge Divides and Love as Jesus Loved.
Christians are sadly, in many ways, we're reflecting the world and the fact that we're just as divided as everyone else. But, you know, Jesus calls us to something better. He said that the world would know that we are his by the way we love each other.
Doctrinal issues are dividing denominations. Southern Baptists are at odds over the role of women in the pulpit. And disagreement over homosexual leaders in the church has split the United Methodist Church. Darling believes the Methodists are dealing with a cultural issue that's in conflict with biblical teachings and should not change church doctrine.
When you talk about sexual ethics, this is pretty clear in Scripture. It's something that Christians can't yield on, that we have to be resolute and stand for it with courage and with compassion, with courage and civility.
Pastor David Anderson is founder of Gracism Global, an organization committed to bridging divides in culture, faith, race, and wealth. He says leaders of both major political parties stoke anger and leverage division on issues like race and abortion when real solutions are needed.
What we have to ask is, how do you get to the bottom line of getting less abortions? How do you get to the bottom line of saying this is what God's ideal is, but this is the real that we live in?
And what is the role of the church? Darling urges Christians to stand for truth and show love for their neighbor, especially when they disagree. So, Dan, how do we disagree well?
Well, I think we disagree well by saying, when it's among Christians, to say, look, this brother or sister I disagree with on this. Here's why. But I love them, not back down on what we believe, but also we can treat our neighbors and see them as God sees them, as people made in the image of God and people for whom Jesus died.
Anderson contends America needs leaders who can bridge the real and the ideal.
What we need are bridge builders, and we need healers to say, listen, I understand both sides, but how can we go forward? Instead of left, instead of right, how do we go higher? And I think that's what we're called to as believers.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
Thank you, Gary. Well, Christians nationwide are remembering the legacy of a leading pastor, apologist, and evangelist. Tim Keller died at the age of 72 on Friday after battling cancer. His ministry in New York has inspired countless leaders to preach and teach with a greater understanding of both Scripture and the idea of community.
Pastor and best-selling author Tim Keller brought the gospel to millions, influencing a generation for Christ. He spoke and wrote in an approachable way that helped answer tough intellectual questions and deep cultural issues.
One way to put the gospel in a nutshell is this: you are more wicked than you ever dared believe, and yet you are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than you ever dared hope.
In 1989, he left his small Virginia congregation outside of Richmond to begin Redeemer Presbyterian in Manhattan. He soon learned how to reach skeptical young professionals with messages that made Scripture both inviting and convicting.
The Bible is not the record of people following the rules and grabbing the blessing. The Bible is a record of grace breaking into people's lives, usually in the form of suffering, who otherwise would never have been able to overcome their own corruption and brokenness.
Keller led Redeemer and its church plants for 28 years, while also publishing best-selling books like The Reason for God. And he co-founded the Gospel Coalition, a fellowship of evangelical churches in the Reformed tradition. Many pastors and ministry leaders have cited his influence on their thinking as a brilliant prophetic scholar who understood God and culture. In 2020, he announced his battle with pancreatic cancer. In recent days, family said he prayed, "I'm ready to see Jesus. Send me home." Heather Sells, CBN News.
A giant in the faith. Gordon?
Truly a giant in the faith. And his last words, "There is no downside to me leaving." What a wonderful expression. To die is gain, is how the Apostle Paul put it. But I love Keller saying, well, there is no downside to me leaving. We will miss him. And certainly 31 books and over 1,500 sermons later, he has left a profound impact on Christianity, not just here in America, but around the world. He will be greatly missed. Let us all remember one of his singular messages: grasp the gospel. You don't earn it. You don't do enough good things for it. You have to grasp it. And when you grasp it, you get it. You finally understand God's unlimited mercy and his grace towards us.